I want to talk to you this evening about a rather complicated topic. It is a rather cerebral or heady topic, but I'm going to do my very best to explain it as clearly as I possibly can. And I believe that if you stay with me, you're going to understand something very powerful about the human mind and about human reason. So, again, my talk is how did the human mind come to be? And I want to draw your attention to someone I'll bet virtually all of you are familiar with. It's John C. Lennox. Dr. Lennox is a mathematician. I believe that he is an emeritus professor at Oxford University. But he has a very provocative quote that I've used online and I've used it in my article. Let me read it to you and let's think a little bit about what he is saying here. Dr. Lennox says either human intelligence ultimately owes its origin to mindless matter, or there is a creator. He then goes on to say this: it is strange that some people claim that it is their intelligence that leads them to prefer the first to the second. Now, I want you to come away with the power of this quote. He says human intelligence either comes from mindless matter on one hand, or there's a creator of the mind. But many intelligent people think that it's their intelligence that leads them to conclude that a mind and intelligence comes from mindless matter rather than an infinite, eternal mind. I think that's such a powerful statement. I see this in the context of an argument that goes back many centuries called the argument from reason. And I'm going to be setting forth that. What's interesting is the argument from reason probably goes back at least to Immanuel Kant, the very famous German philosopher who lived in the 19th century. But there are others who think that this argument may go all the way back to Plato, who lived about 500 years before the birth of Christ. So let's move further into this discussion. Here's the question that I have for you. Did mind make nature, or did nature make mind? I think this is a helpful way of thinking about this argument from reason, this question about where our mind intelligence came from. So, did mind make nature, or did nature make our minds? Christian theism affirms that an infinite divine mind created the human mind in the creator's image. So you and I, we are temporal creatures, we are finite creatures, but scientists tell us that the brain that we have, this brain mind, it is the most complicated mechanism in the known universe. Christian theism says that God, who is eternal and infinite, created us with a mind that's temporal and finite, but we bear the image of God. And part of that bearing the imago Dei in Latin is to have the capacity of rational thought. So our mind comes from another mind. Our mind, our finite mind, comes from an eternal mind. Now, secular naturalism affirms that the human mind is the unguided from a non-mind product of evolution. So if you're a naturalist, you have to believe, since there's no mind behind the universe, there's no God, the human mind somehow through evolution came from a non-mind. And this is getting back to what Lennox said. Some people use their intelligence to conclude that their mind came from a mindless source. So these are two competing worldviews. These are two competing ideas about how to make sense of the human mind, human intelligence, and human reasoning. Here's C.S. Lewis. My first introduction to the argument from reason came from C.S. Lewis. It was his little book, Mere Christianity, back in the late 1970s that really led me to think about my faith and to give consideration to Christianity being true. Well, in Lewis's The Case for Christianity, he summarizes a version from the argument from reason. And again, this is a little bit heady, but stay with me because C.S. Lewis is such a careful writer and thinker, I think this is going to come across very powerfully to you. Lewis says, supposing there was no intelligence behind the universe, that would be atheism. No creative mind. In that case, nobody designed the brain when the atoms inside my skull happened for physical or chemical reasons to arrange themselves in a certain way. This gives as a byproduct the sensation I call thought. But if so, how can I trust my thinking to be true? If my mind came from a non mind, how do I have confidence that I can trust my mind, trust my thinking? And Lewis goes on to say this. He says it's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way it splashes itself will give you a map of London. But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course, I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought, so I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. Now, again, Lewis, in his very thoughtful and reflective way, is saying, look, if there's no mind behind the universe, how do I know that my mind and brain are giving me true beliefs about reality? And if my atheism tells me to be suspicious and to doubt whether I can have reasonable and truthful beliefs about reality, how could I ever even support atheism? And it concludes, how could I then argue against God? I think that this is a heady argument. It's technical, but I think it's very powerful, and we want to think through it carefully. Now, one person who has helped me to think through C.S. Lewis's argument is an American philosopher named Richard Pertil, and he had a book entitled C.S. Lewis, The Case for Christian Faith. He took Lewis's arguments in Mere Christianity and Miracles, various other books of Lewis, and kind of laid them out. Now, notice what he says here about Lewis's argument from reason. He says one way of getting a preliminary insight into C.S. Lewis's argument from reason is to ask whether nature is the product of mind or mind is the product of nature. If God created nature, as Christians believe, then nature is understandable by reason because it is the product of reason. Now let's take a look at that question. Is nature the product of mind, or is mind the product of nature? So if nature is the product of mind, that's the Christian perspective. The world in which we live came from a mind. The world in which we live didn't create our mind. From a Christian point of view, the natural material world is the product of mind. It came from a mind. So mind produced nature. Mind made the natural world. And Pertil then clarifies the point that the mind is the product of nature. Well, that's naturalism. So if mind came out of the natural world without an intellectual source, that's naturalism. Naturalism, secularism, atheism, they would say that nature made our mind. How it happened? An incredible type of miracle, but not a miracle guided by a divine hand or a divine providence. So let's kind of set these side by side. Again, Christianity says that nature or the cosmos or the universe is expectedly understandable by reason or by science because it is the product of reason. Now let me take that apart a little bit and try to explain it in very clear terms. If God exists and God brought the universe into being, then the world that God made is characterized by laws and logic and reason. So if the universe came from an intelligent mind, we should expect that the universe we live in right now has laws, has reason, has logic. So the reason why scientists can study the world, why they can discover the laws of nature, why they can track the intelligibility of the universe is that intelligibility came out of a mind. So God, with his infinite and eternal intelligence, created a world and imbued that world with intelligence. And then he made you and me, and he's given us our finite faculties that can understand the world. Here I'd like to quote Paul Davies. Paul Davies is a leading cosmologist and physicist. He teaches at Arizona State University. I think it was born in Britain or maybe Australia. But Davies says this. He says the thing that he stays awake at night thinking about is, why is the universe intelligible? Now, remember, Davies is kind of an agnostic. Sometimes he comes close, I think, to believing or affirming God, but then he kind of steps back. But what Davies is saying is, why is the universe here? But maybe even a more remarkable thing is, why is it that we can understand it? Why are we creatures here in a world and we can understand the intelligibility of the universe? Well, I think Christianity gives that an answer. The universe came from a mind. The universe is characterized by the thought of God, and we're made in God's image, and God gave us the faculties to be able to not only do science, but do philosophy, to do mathematics, to do art. All of these things come out of the image of God. Now, that's the Christian understanding. That's the Christian explanation. That's Christian theism. Let's look at the competing worldview of naturalism. And naturalism just means that nature is all there is. The material, physical world is all there is. So nature, the cosmos, is unexpectedly understandable by reason or by science because it is not a product of reason. Now let's take that apart. If there's no mind behind the universe, if there's no God, and if the universe came into being, I don't know how it would come into being, but the universe came from a mindless, personless source. So the fact that the universe is intelligible and human beings have the intellectual faculties to understand the universe, that's shocking. It's totally unexpected. I remember reading an article by Eugene Wigner. He wrote this article in 1960, and he said that mathematics is this almost miraculous thing. Math gives us the capacity to track reality. And he says, why does that work? Why does math work? Where did math come from? Well, from a Christian point of view, we're not, this is not an unexpected thing. We expect math to work because we believe that God is not only the great mathematician, he's the great logician, he's the great engineer, he's the great architect. But in a universe without God, there is no architect, there is no mind, there is no mathematician, there is no designer. And so the fact that science works and we can do science, it's totally unexpected. It's a shocking reality. Could I suggest that it's more extraordinary that a mind and reason would come from a non-mind and a non-reason? That's more incredible than that a God would create the universe. So if you're going to be an atheist and you're going to accept the worldview of naturalism, you're going to have to buy into this. And it creates intellectual consternation, you might say. Well, on the left, of course, is the great C.S. Lewis, who was a literary scholar, but he was probably one of the best read person of his generation. He understood philosophy. He was interested in science. Richard Purtill was himself, until his death recently, he was a philosopher. He's Catholic. And Purtill was a specialist on both C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. So those are the two men and their ideas that we've been talking about. And there's those books. C.S. Lewis, his book Miracles, is where he first sets forth this argument from reason, that the only way we can trust our reasoning is if they come from an intelligent source, God. And of course, here's Purtill's very helpful book, C.S. Lewis, The Case for the Christian Faith. I certainly recommend both to you. Now let's go a little further here. So now let's ask the question. Philosophers talk about what we call metaphysics. By metaphysics, we mean what is ultimate reality? If you get right down to reality itself, the fundamental reality of the universe, of the world, what is it? What is at the bottom line when we've got right to the first principles, what is reality? Well, again, I'm going to set forth these two views side by side. Let's first begin with naturalism or materialism or physicalism. Uh, Here is the description. According to naturalism or materialism or physicalism, and again, materialism, everything is matter. Physicalism, everything is physical. So there is no mind or intelligence behind all this. Naturalistic materialism or physicalism says the fundamental building blocks of reality, the fundamental building blocks of reality are tiny entities called atoms, which are reducible to even smaller particles like protons, neutrons, and electrons. So it's bits of material all the way down. There's kind of a humorous story that philosophers like to tell. And the story is that the professor is presenting the idea of what is at the bottom of ultimate reality. When you drill down, what are the fundamental characteristics of reality? And there's a lady in the audience, and she raises her hand and she says, "Well, I think it's turtles." And the professor is kind of baffled by this, and he says, "What do you mean turtles?" He says, "Well," she says, "it's turtles all the way down." Well, from a naturalistic, atheistic, materialistic physicalism, it's bits of matter all the way down. You can drill down to the atoms, but you can go deeper. And that takes us to particles, protons, neutrons, electrons. And that's where we're at now. Maybe we'll sink deeper into reality, but materialism says it's bits of matter all the way down. Now, I want you to ask yourself a question here. And the question is, how could a mind come from bits of matter? How could intelligence, how could something non-physical, immaterial, how could the human mind come from something that is merely the bits of matter? They're not intelligent, they're physical, they're material. It's very difficult to move from materialism and physicalism and explain things like human thought, human reason, human mind. Again, the naturalists have a burden, and the burden is how do they explain the mental from bits of matter itself? Now, on the other side, we've got Christian theism again. They would say the ultimate reality behind the physical world is an infinite, eternal, and tripersonal God, Father, Son, and Spirit, who is the creator and sustainer of all things. So it's persons all the way down. That is, when we get to the bottom level of reality, it's not bits of matter, it's God. If you get to the fundamental reality, there was only God. And then the Father, Son, and Spirit called all reality, all contingent realities, all dependent realities, like the universe, like you and me. God called all of us into existence. In Latin, we call that the creation ex nihilo. And so Christian thinkers like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, they would say at the fundamental level of reality, it's minds all the way down. If you get right to the bottom of reality, if you're a physicalist, it's just bits of matter. But if you're a Christian theist, what undergirds ultimate reality is the mind of God. And mind can only come from mind. Naturalists have so much difficulty explaining the mind that some physicalist philosophers have said evolution can't explain it. Maybe mind is part of everything. That's called panpsychism in philosophy. And so some philosophers have said there's no way that you can get minds from bits of matter. So maybe mind is built into reality itself. Now, we can debate that topic, but what I want you to appreciate is that's a big concession. When atheist philosophers say that materialism cannot explain mind, they're agreeing with us that mind has to come from mind. And so panpsychism would say everything has some kind of consciousness. We can talk about that in the Q&A period if you'd like to. Okay, let's then ask this question. Who has the best explanation? We've got naturalism with its materialism and physicalism, bits of matter all the way down. Then you've got Christian theism with this tripersonal, eternal, infinite God who creates the world, and so it's minds all the way down. So now let's ask the question, how do the two worldviews explain personhood? A person is a being who has a mind and a will and emotions. Well, where does person come from? Well, from a materialist, physicalist, or naturalist, atheist point of view, persons somehow emerge from impersonal and unintelligent natural processes and forces. That's hard to swallow. That's a big pill to swallow. Persons came from the impersonal and the unintelligent natural processes and forces. Wow, that's a lot to accept. In fact, let me give you a reflection that I have. On the scholar team, I'm one of the few that are not scientists. My background is in theology and philosophy. But here's what I've shared with my colleagues. I said, I'm sometimes puzzled by the scientific enterprise because the scientific enterprise, they go looking for the brightest students, young men and women who are very good at math and science. They're STEM people, science, technology, engineering, medicine, um, all of these kind of STEM disciplines. Well, they go looking for the best students. So MIT or Caltech or science universities around the world, they recruit the best scientists, the best students who have the best scores in college, and then they give them extraordinary intellectual training and all of this. And by the time they become a scientist, they're then told there's no intelligence behind the universe. See the irony? They're looking for the brightest minds. They give them, those bright minds, the greatest training, only to kind of unleash a philosophy that says all of these intelligent persons and beings came from the unintelligible, came from the impersonal. I find that ironic that such a cerebral discipline, in large measure, most scientists would probably fit into some form of naturalism. Now, from a Christian point of view, as a super personal triune being, God made human beings personal and intelligent creatures. So our minds came from his mind. Our intelligence came from God's intelligence. We should expect the world to be an intelligent place because it was made by an architect. It was made by an engineer. It was made by a mathematician. It was made by a logician. We have these capacities because we bear the image of God. Now ask yourself, which of these worldviews is easier or harder to accept? Let's move on. How about minds? Where did minds? We've talked about persons. Now let's talk about minds. From materialism and physicalism, mindless and or non-conscious natural processes produce beings with minds that are self-conscious. Talk about an effect being greater than the cause. If you're a naturalist, materialist, physicalist, you have to believe that the mind came from the mindless. Intelligence came from non-intelligence. Consciousness came from non-consciousness. Wow. So the effect and the cause is exponentially greater than the cause. You get minds from non-minds. You get intelligence from non-intelligence. That's a lot to swallow. Christian theism says God's infinite, eternal, and self-conscious mind is the cause of the infinite, self-conscious minds of his creatures. Now, again, which of those is harder to believe? Which worldview has the greater explanatory power? One more. How about our rationality? The materialist, the physicalist says human rational faculties and sensory organs came from a blind, non-rational survival mechanism. Rationality came from a blind, non-rational survival mechanism. I mean, nature can't think. Nature isn't a person. Nature isn't in itself rational. Human beings, the product apparently of evolution, we can think, we can do reason, we're persons. And so if you're a naturalist and an atheist, you have to believe that an impersonal, non-rational, non-mindful universe coughed up creatures who are persons, who have minds and possess rationality. From Christian theism, human rational faculty and sensory organs were created in the image of God. I'm asking, who has the greater explanatory power here? Okay, let's look at abductive reasoning. So in philosophy, there are kind of three ways you can frame your arguments. You can argue deductively, and if you do it properly, you're going to get certainly true conclusions. You can then also reason inductively, and much of science is inductive, though scientists think deductively and inductively, and scientists think abductively. But with induction, if you do it right, you're going to get probably true conclusions. Then there is abductive reasoning. Charles Peirce, the American pragmatist philosopher, kind of set forth this type of reasoning. And this is where, if you do your reasoning properly, you get plausibly true conclusions. So they're not certain, they're not probable, they're plausible explanations. Now, here's the way an abductive argument typically reasons. The first 2 points are premises, they're the support. And then the third one is the conclusion. And to have an argument, you have to have three things. You have to make a claim, that's your conclusion. You have to provide support, those are your premises. And you have to have an inference, the reasoning process that takes you from the support to the conclusion. Well, here is the abductive reasoning. The extraordinary experience X is recognized. Premise 2, but if A is true, X would be an expected matter of course. Conclusion, thus there is a plausible reason to conclude A is true. Now, if that seems a little sketchy to you, let me make it concrete. I'm going to argue abductively for Christian theism. Premise 1, the extraordinary human experience of mind is universally recognized. And by the way, this shakes up a lot of people. One of the great questions, not only in philosophy, but also in science, is how do we understand the mind? Where did consciousness come from? So premise 1, the extraordinary human experience of mind is universally recognized. Premise 2, but if Christian theism is true, then mind would be an expected matter of course. Conclusion, thus there is a plausible reason to conclude Christian theism is true. We've got consciousness, we've got personhood, we've got these mental states. We all recognize that. But then if Christianity were true, that's exactly what we would expect. Therefore, from an abductive reasoning point of view, it's plausible. If since Christianity can explain mind, then it's plausible that Christianity is indeed true. Again, that's abductive reasoning. We call that inference to the best explanation. It's done by philosophers, it's done by scientists, it's done by doctors, it's done by police detectives. When I go to my doctor, he goes through a diagnosis. Anybody who engages in diagnostic reasoning is reasoning abductively. Okay, let me move to the last part of my talk. I think that there are three strikes against evolutionary naturalism. Now, three strikes there, you can tell I'm an old baseball player. I don't know if anybody plays baseball in India or other parts of the world. I will tell you right now, probably the best baseball player in America happens to be a Japanese player who has plays for the Los Angeles Dodgers. His name is Otani, and he's closing in on 50 home runs and 50 stolen bases, which boggles the baseball observers. But in baseball, you get three strikes, and once the third strike comes, you're out. Well, I'm going to use a baseball metaphor here. There are potential defeaters for naturalism, for materialism, for physicalism. The idea that atheistic evolutionary naturalism can reliably account for man's rational faculties and explain how human beings can discover truth faces three potential defeaters, three strikes, three defeaters. That means your argument or your ideas have crashed and they burn. Let's go further. Here's my first strike. Naturalism postulates a non-rational source for man's rationality. Naturalism postulates a non-rational source for man's rationality. If a person accepts the evolutionary naturalistic worldview, then he must also accept that the ultimate source of people's reasoning faculties was not itself rational, wasn't endowed with reason, nor was it personal, it wasn't self-aware or intelligent, and it was not teleological, it wasn't purposive. Now, again, think about what we've said earlier. If God doesn't exist, then minds and rationality and personhood came from something that was not endowed by reason, nor was it personal, self-aware, or intelligent. And evolution without God, it has no design or purposive value. Rather, the source was a non-rational, impersonal, purposeless process consisting of a combination of genetic mutations, variation, and environmental factors. We call that natural selection. None of those things are in and of themselves personal, rational, or conceivable in that way, cerebral, if you will. Naturalism therefore postulates that a combination of random chance and blind impersonal natural processes, physical and chemical in nature, produced humanity's rational faculties. Now, this basic idea of how can I trust my mind if what brought me into being was not itself a mind? How can I trust? And that's C.S. Lewis. That's that argument from reason that goes back to Kant, maybe even all the way back to Plato. If what produced me was not a mind, then how do I know I can trust my mind? Well, guess who was very troubled by this idea? Charles Darwin. Notice what Darwin says in his letter to W. Graham, dated July 3rd, 1881. This is from the Life and Letters of Charles Darwin. Darwin was a very sharp fellow. He was not just a good scientist, he understood theology and philosophy. Sometimes we kind of demonize Darwin, but Darwin was a thoughtful thinker and he was skeptical of his new ideas. Here's what he writes. He says, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the conviction of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the conviction of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? This is a powerful point. Even Darwin recognized, how can I have confidence in my mind if what stands behind it was not itself rational? Let's go further. Here's strike number 2. Evolution promotes the species' survivability not its true beliefs. Evolution produces a species' survivability, not its true beliefs. Evolution by natural selection is said to have taken billions of years to produce intellectual and sensory capacities in people. But that process operated solely in light of survival value and reproductive advantage. There's the core of evolution: survival value and reproductive advantage. So the species that adapt, they're put in a category to flourish, and those who couldn't adapt fell out. And so it's about survival value and reproductive advantage. In other words, evolution functions only to enhance a particular organism's adaptation to the environment, thus promoting the species' continued existence. What a particular species believes about its environment is non-essential to the process. Here's Francis Crick, the co-founder of the DNA, right? Himself an atheist. Notice what he says. This is from his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. Crick says, our highly developed brains, after all, were not evolved under the pressure of discovering scientific truth, but only to enable us to be clever enough to survive and leave descendants. So if we're able to pick bananas and we're able to throw rocks, and that those things will help us survive, is there anything that in that evolutionary state that would guarantee that our beliefs and our ideas are true? Here's John Gray from his book, Straw Dogs, Thoughts on Humans and Other Animals. Gray is a leading atheist. He's a leading philosopher. Notice what he says. He says, the human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. To think otherwise is to resurrect the pre-Darwinian error that humans are different from the animals. Darwinian theory tells us that an interest in truth is not needed for survival or reproduction. Truth has no systematical advantage over error. He's an atheist. He's a naturalist. He's an evolutionist. And he says that evolution provides for evolutionary success. It doesn't necessarily give you truth. Truth has no systematic advantage over error. Wow. Here's John Lennox again. He says, despite this, Hawking, like so many other critics of religion, wants us to believe that we're nothing but a random collection of molecules to the end product of the end product of a mindless process. Again, minds coming from non-minds. He says, this, if true, would undermine the very rationality we need to study science. If the brain were really the result of an unguided process, then there is no reason to believe in its capacity to tell us the truth. That is so powerful. Evolutionary naturalism appears to lead to an inevitable insecurity concerning the truth of one's beliefs. This has led Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga to conclude, and this is Alvin Plantinga taught at Notre Dame for many years. He is widely considered possibly the greatest living Christian philosopher. Plantinga says, evolution and naturalism are not merely uneasy bedfellows. They are more like belligerent combatants. One can't rationally accept both evolution and naturalism. Naturalism, or evolutionary naturalism, seems to lead to a deep and pervasive skepticism. He then says, it leads to the conclusion that our cognitive or belief-producing faculties, memory, perception, logical insight, etc., are unreliable and cannot be trusted to produce a preponderance of truth, of true beliefs over false. There's Al Plantinga from his evolutionary argument against naturalism. Strike three. Here is my final point here. False beliefs illustrate evolutionary naturalism's epistemological unreliability. That's a mouthful, but I'm going to try to explain it. Some naturalistic scientists and philosophers today have only served to heighten Darwin's original doubt by suggesting that man's inherent religious impulse is itself driven by evolution. In other words, beliefs in God, objective morality, and life after death are evolutionary generated beliefs that must have served some survival purpose in the distant past. Here's scientist and atheist Lawrence Krauss. Listen to what Krauss notes. He is a virulent atheist. This is what he says. This is from Science and Religion Share Fascination in Things Unseen. This is a popular article he wrote for the New York Times. He says, religious belief that the universe is the handiwork of an all-powerful being is not subject to refutation. This sort of reliance on faith may itself have an evolutionary basis. There has been talk of a God gene, the idea that an early advantage in the struggle for survival for those endowed with a belief in a hidden patrimony that gives order, purpose, and meaning to the universe we experience. Notice what he's saying here. He says these beliefs that God exists, these beliefs that there is objective morality, beliefs that will survive death, these beliefs helped us survive. But Krauss says none of them are true. So has evolution put false beliefs in our mind? It's not just that our beliefs don't come from a rational source. Now we're being told that evolution puts false beliefs in our mind because those false beliefs do more to help us survive than possibly true beliefs. There's Krauss raising the question of the God gene. Attributing mankind's false religious beliefs from a naturalist perspective to the evolutionary process, however, only adds suspicion to Darwin's original doubt. If evolution is responsible for humankind's virtually universal religious impulse, which from a naturalistic point of view is patently false and even pernicious, according to Dawkins, then human history shows that false beliefs about reality have promoted human survivability more than true beliefs. Strike three. Here are those three strikes. Naturalism postulates a non-rational source for man's rationality. Strike two, evolution promotes a species' survivability, not its true beliefs. Strike three, false beliefs illustrate evolutionary naturalism's epistemological unreliability.